So continuing with motivational interviewing, so if you didn't watch the video on the stages of change, it's really important that you watch that first, because the key of motivational interviewing is understanding those stages and focusing in on moving your client from stage to stage. And so as a nutshell, I've sat through so many times people teaching motivational interviewing. I've looked at the books and the trainings. And one of the things that people do is they tend to give you a really long history on it, and they tend to tell you why it's important. And while those things are great, so if you want to do that, I encourage you to do it. I will not be doing that, and I am not the long, drawn-out history person. So really, I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't care how it came to be. I don't really care to give you like a big list on why it's important. If you clicked on this video, someone along the way has told you that motivational interviewing is important, or something that you should know and you've already come in to do it. So let's just operate on the fact that we know it's a good idea. So looking at motivational interviewing, as I mentioned in the last one, the initial design is not for counseling. And so this is not designed in the beginning to be a counseling per se technique beyond intake or assessment. And so don't just rely on motivational interviewing. If you do, you're really going to be falling more into case management or peer support level, and you're not going to be really doing excellent mental health counseling. And that's what we really want to get towards. And so it's something that we use to get enough information so that we can create good interventions and good treatment plans. And so motivational interviewing is basically information gathering for the counselor. The main purpose of counseling or being the counselor is learning how to see the world through the client's eyes so that you can help the client move forward in the direction they want to move forward in, and move towards their goals, their own personal values, the things they believe are important, the things they want to do, fostering independence. And so as a clinician, everything that you do is going to really center in, can you see the world through the client's eyes? And so when you're talking about seeing the world through the client's eyes, in counseling we use the term culture, and that means everything that has impacted the way your client sees the world. And so to be able to do that, to be able to see the world through your client's eyes, you have to gather a lot of information on their culture. The other thing that you're going to have to gather a lot of information on is their motivation. Why do they do what they do? And so in a nutshell, motivational interviewing is asking your client questions that help you, the counselor, figure out what motivates them. What motivated them to come in to see you? What is going to motivate them to move from this stage of change to the next stage of change? Until you know someone's motivation, you can't design a good counseling treatment plan. Think of it this way. If you have a child that really loves chocolate and you use chocolate as motivation, that child's going to do really well. Well, if you have a child who doesn't love chocolate and you try to use chocolate as motivation, it is not going to do any good for them. And that's the same process. With counseling, you can't take your own personal values as the beliefs, what you as a counselor, what motivates you or what you think is important, and automatically use that to try to move your client forward or encourage your client to progress through the stages of change. You have to get inside their head and see the world through their eyes and understand what is important to them. Now, to be honest with you, most people, when you start asking them about what's most important to them, they actually give you a little bit of BS. We usually respond with what the proper response should be, or at least what we think the proper response to be. So if you just jump in and you ask your client right away, like, what brings you into, the addiction treatment at this time? Why did you decide to change now? What thoughts go through your mind? What's the most important things to you? Chances are the things they tell you right out the gate are probably not going to be super accurate. Sometimes it's because the client's just not being truthful, and that's going to be shame. They're afraid to tell you what's really important to them. And then sometimes it's just that they don't really know. They really haven't gotten in and find out what motivates them and what helps them move forward. And so as a counselor, as part of the cultural gathering, you have to gather information on their motivation. And it's not just as simple as asking one question. And so motivational interviewing is just that. We're going to get in, we're going to try to figure out why they do things, but guess what we're never going to do? We are never going to ask the question why. Why is a very, it can make the client really defensive. It gives the impression that you don't think they're doing things right. It's a very negative question that's going to really bring about resistance nearly always. I'll give you an example. So if the client said, I decided that I want to leave my job, and you say, why are you leaving your job? That can very quickly give the client the indication that you don't agree with their decision. And so when you're looking at motivational interviewing, it's really important that you remove that word why from your vocabulary as much as possible, and you want to look in on how and what. Now, again, when you go in and you look at a motivational training class, you will see very often a lot of closed questions and a lot of detail-oriented questions. Motivational interviewing was not initially designed for counselors or mental health clinicians. And so it's important that you don't put aside your basic counseling skills to pick up the mantle of motivational interviewing. And so in counseling, in your very basic early learning counseling skills, you likely learned that you're not supposed to ask closed questions. That stands. So when you're doing motivational interviewing, you should not be asking closed questions. I'll give you some examples I see really often. Can you tell me? That is a closed question. I could say no. Do you think? That is a closed question. I could say no. When you're looking at getting information from your client, you really want to rely on how and what, and you're really going to want to lean towards solution-focused questions. And so that's a video you'll want to watch after to get a little bit more information on what that looks like. But what you're doing with the client is you're focusing in on process, not details of the story. So the client says, I got in a fight with my boyfriend. What did you fight about? That is detail-oriented. That is not process-oriented. We don't care what they thought about. As a clinician, it's really not relevant. What's relevant is what emotional and coping process did your client go through. So when you're trying to figure out what is driving them, why they're acting the way they are or saying or doing the things, why they're fighting with their boyfriend, why did they choose this boyfriend, why are they bringing this up for you? Those are all motivation. You're going to look at those how and their what questions. Look for the client's experience through coping or emotions. What feelings came up for you while you were fighting with him? To get to motivation, what feelings came up for you before you started fighting for him? What do you think caused you to respond back to him so negatively? What were you trying to achieve in this argument with him? And so you're looking to find out, why was this person arguing? Why didn't they just walk away? Why didn't they just stop the argument? Or maybe they started it. Why did they start this? What were they trying to get out of it? That's their motivation. That's the why. And so motivational interviewing, then again, you're going to try to ask those questions, but you're going to want to try to do it in open-ended with how and what. And you're going to try to look at emotional process or coping process. What feelings were you experiencing? What was happening in your body at the time? How did you manage those feelings? What thoughts went through your mind? And you're just like a private investigator who's gathering all the information you can about the way that your client views things so that you can understand their motivation. As I mentioned with motivational interviewing, you're really moving your client. The goal is to move your client through the stages of change. So initially in that pre-contemplative and that contemplative stage of change, you're focusing on helping the client identify what's happening. So they need to identify their own motivation. They need to identify their own values, what's important to them, what are they trying to achieve, what do they really care about. And so in that identification process, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at what is their driving force or the motivation behind the things that they're doing. As you take them into the preparation, the action stage of change, it's essential that by that point, by moving and going into preparation, you as the clinician should already have a pretty good idea of what motivates them. And so if you don't, you need to slow down. Because in that preparation stage of change, if they are not making plans, incorporating in the things that actually motivate them, their plans are not going to be successful. And so let's say your client is really motivated by spending time with their children. Then you're making those preparations and those plans and those goals, you're going to want to center it around that so that it's increasing or improving their quality time with their children. Maybe your client has legal problems and he's going to court-ordered counseling and he's just trying to meet the requirements. You'll have to know what he's trying to achieve, why he's trying to achieve them before you set those goals to move them along the way. And so as the counselor, you have to be using broaching. Again, it's another video if you haven't seen it. But you have to be talking about the client's culture. You have to be talking about the reason behind the decisions they make and what moves them through the process. As you move your client through each stage of change, that client should become more aware. So by the time your client is in the action stage of change, they should have a pretty good handle on their own motivation, and they should be actively setting goals that operate within their own value system. In the maintenance stage of change, they should definitely be very aware. It shouldn't be a surprise to them. They should be able to plan and do it on their own. Counseling is working your way out of a job. Your goal is to teach your client how to do these processes without you. And so as you do that, it's very important that you help your client become just as aware of their process and how they do things as you, the counselor, is aware. So don't lean away from that psychoeducation or that emotional processing and talk them through. Now, I just want to take another couple minutes to talk about the difference between detail-oriented questions and process-oriented questions, because this is a place where I see a lot of counselors struggling. Detail-oriented questions is what we as society, particularly in the American culture, are taught to ask. And that is, what were you wearing? Where did you go? What did you do? What did you fight about? What did he say? Those are all details that as a counselor, when you're trying to get into the client's emotional process, you're trying to teach them how to better manage their feelings and their bodies, and they're better to use better coping skills and move forward. The details of what happened are not relevant. And so when you're looking at process-oriented questions, you really want to highlight or focus in on what thoughts and feelings are going through the client's mind, what body sensations are happening in the client, so that's emotional and physiological process, and then coping process. How are they managing these things? How are they managing these thoughts and feelings? How did they keep from yelling? What did they do? Did they employ an avoidance tactic? And so helping the client identify those processes and those negative avoidance tactics and the negative coping skills or the non-helpful or taking away coping skills, and helping them identify positive or adding behavior coping skills. It's essential that you are focusing in on what is going to get the client the fastest result, not just going off of your own curiosity. I want to know what they thought about because I'm interested. What they thought about in the moment is not relevant when it comes to preparing your client to better manage their thoughts and feelings the next time that they get into an argument. And so you have to identify that trigger. You have to think about what feelings went through their mind and body at that time and how to move them forward. And so when you are learning how to ask questions, understanding the difference between detail-oriented questions and process-oriented questions is really the one thing that is going to move you from an average or a mediocre counselor into an excellent or far above average counselor. So it is something that I encourage you to continue working on and to think about how you can more often include questions that are focused on emotional and coping process instead of story details.